Welcome to the Geneva Graduate Institute in Conversation with podcast series. I'm Lena Menge, Manager of Strategic Partnerships and Public Relations. This episode features a conversation between Stuart Campo, Team Lead for Data Responsibility at the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, Charlotte Lindsey, Chief Public Policy Officer at the CyberPeace Institute, Balthasar Staehelin, Special Envoy for Foresight and Techplomacy at the International Committee of the Red Cross, and Achim Wennmann, Director for Strategic Partnerships at the Geneva Graduate Institute. This discussion sheds light on the cyber threat landscape and its impact for the humanitarian sector, and focuses on the meaning of humanitarian protection in the digital space and the role International Geneva should play.
How to protect humanitarian organizations in the digital space? This is our question tonight. And Charlotte, I would like to go straight in. You work with the CyberPeace Institute. What is your big picture analysis of the question?
So the CyberPeace Institute monitors cyber attacks and incidences against vulnerable communities, particularly non-governmental organizations and the humanitarian sector. And what we see is a threat landscape which is getting more severe for the sector, primarily because threat actors see that humanitarian actors are low risk for high reward, because they don't have a very good cybersecurity posture. Where we see the types of attacks that are happening, we see threats that are around more destructive attacks or disruptive attacks to disrupt the operations of non-governmental organizations in the sector. We also see ransomware attacks, really to try to also access the data of organizations and hold data to ransom, so data weaponization. And we also see cyber influence operations, so misinformation and disinformation campaigns against actors in the sector.
It's fascinating what you say. So we really see the manifestation that cyberspace is a new space of war, where specific actors are using cyber tools in order to disrupt operations. Now, from the humanitarian sector, do you see that? How do you experience it? What is your assessment, Stuart, on the big picture on how to protect humanitarian organizations in the digital space?
Sure. I think what we see is an awareness, but not yet an understanding at the level of the sector. We know that this is now an additional complexity in most of the environments where we operate. We know that digital and cyber threats pose additional risks to ourselves and the people that we seek to serve, but we haven't yet fully understood, I would argue, the extent to which these threats are present, and perhaps more importantly, the depth of vulnerabilities to what Charlotte was just describing that our organizations face. We haven't really grappled yet, both collectively or at the institutional level, with what it means to be cyber secure, or even frankly, digitally resilient against these threats. And practically, the most important impact of this thus far is the erosion of trust. Trust between humanitarian actors, trust between us and the people that we serve, and critically in this space, trust between us and the third-party service providers whose technologies and services we rely on.
I just want to follow up with you again, Charlotte, on this. Is the humanitarian sector really special in this vulnerability, or is it just of many are these vulnerabilities which are kind of visible in many other different sectors, in the entire NGO sector or the entire educational sector? So, is there something specific from your perspective of why the cybersecurity aspect is so important for the humanitarian space?
Well, humanitarian actors hold very sensitive and often very personal data on individuals, which makes them highly vulnerable if they cannot secure that data. So the last mile of humanitarian actors is with people who are highly vulnerable, and often in very complex operational environments where that data could be used and turned against the very beneficiaries of the humanitarian response. So that makes it very unique. The types of data held in very complex operational settings where it can be very difficult for actors to operate offline. And then when you add the complexities of operating online, it can make them highly vulnerable because actors are looking to disrupt the activities of those humanitarian operators.
Charlotte, you mentioned the last mile, and that brings me to you, Balthasar. You and ICRC, but of course many other humanitarian actors are working on the last mile, close to the people who are affected, the most vulnerable, all of a sudden are becoming more vulnerable because there is a new space of war. Now, from your experience, what are the kind of activities in place right now? How you try to grapple with this phenomenon and the last mile, but also up at headquarters here?
I think it's important that we really focus on what it actually means for people and not for humanitarian organizations. It's really about the people as a starting point, their vulnerability. And the last mile concept is interesting because you can see the last mile, of course, reaching people in an analog way, but leaving a data trail through your action. And you can also sort of say the last mile can become digital in the sense that people can also benefit from digital services in places where you can't reach them, which immediately shows that the whole digital way we go about humanitarian operations has opportunities and risks. And what that means is a requirement to be thoughtful about it, to be as savvy as we can. Stuart alluded to it, that we may need to become more digital savvy to understand, to be thoughtful about it, to have standards against which we hold ourselves accountable. And of course comes to mind data protection. It's not the only standard, but data protection, which is essentially, and there is a big misunderstanding, not about protecting data. It is about protecting people. And what can be a privacy embarrassment in a context of peace can become indeed an issue of life and death in war zones. Then there is a huge investment, of course, required in terms of upskilling the staff, our own behavior, our mindset, in terms of the kind of technology we use, the kind of tools we use, but also, and I come perhaps afterwards back to that point, thinking about how can we lift certain concepts of the analog world into the digital space. The Red Cross essentially depends in its operations on not being attacked in the first place. And I think we have to think, how can we ensure not to be attacked in the first place in the digital sphere, and of course then take the necessary steps to become more cyber resilient.
Which connects clearly to the notion of humanitarian protection, which is an extension of humanitarian protection into that space. Now, if we connect briefly to also the diplomatic aspect of humanitarian work, the humanitarian diplomacy or the humanitarian dialogue, how do you work where traditionally in the analog world, it's about trust, it's about the safe space, the individuals, the eyeball contact. Now, how do you deal with this humanitarian dialogue aspect when it comes to cyberspace and the vulnerabilities mentioned? Perhaps, Stuart, I bring you into this conversation.
Sure. And we actually produced some guidance on this during COVID as ICRC and OCHA, because it's a pretty particular aspect of the work that we do in terms of ensuring secure communications with groups that we're engaging in dialogue with, and maintaining that trust when you haven't had the contact you're describing, to make sure that we can discuss the often very sensitive issues and potentially life and death issues in terms of the impact, if the discussion is leaked, on the people that we serve. So part of the consideration is, what technologies and channels do we use? How do we collectively identify what good looks like and do that consistently? But then there's the principled aspect as well, and the compromising of the principles if we get it wrong. A lot of the discussion now is about how we maintain neutral, independent, and impartial humanitarian space in the digital realm. And when you have service providers that are affiliated either directly or indirectly with different states, different worldviews, different data protection regimes, that becomes incredibly complex. And I think what we've seen with some of the recent false flags in the digital realm is that we are actively, as Charlotte described earlier, subject to attacks. We are subject to undermining our trust in an intentional way by actors operating in the digital sphere. And we have to be able to stay ahead of that. We have to maintain our own communication strategies and really be clear about who we are, how we do what we do, and how, whether it's analog or digital, we must maintain principled humanitarian space, access, and delivery.
Balthasar, over to you on the same question.
I really can only echo what Stuart said. It's true that lifting our capacity in an analog world in the digital space needs a rethinking of how we operate and what kind of technology we use. And I believe if we look a few years ahead, there may be belligerents asking us, show us what technology you use, and we tell you in which camp we are. Or we may not be able to use certain technologies because, be it by sanctions or by self-exclusion from certain markets, that the world will and may well fall apart into digital regions. We will see an internet that maybe becomes a splinter net. And what does that mean for humanitarians, who by definition should go through the walls, should go through the boundaries, should go cross-line, reach people, and I would sort of say independently on whose control they're under. And that means that technology is too important to leave to technologists alone.
Now, that I want to go back to you, Charlotte, and perhaps get a little bit outside of the humanitarian sector again as we talk about best practices. Now, the CyberPeace Institute, you look at many different sectors, many industries. Now, where do you see best practices out there that are really relevant for the humanitarian sector? We have heard already a number of pointers, no, with respect to the staff preparedness and also investment into the necessary infrastructure. But where do you see elements that you could see there's something out there, be that in the private sector, be that in other sectors, that might be relevant for the humanitarian sector?
And I definitely think that when we look at something like attacks against the healthcare sector, it's really important to look at what has worked and how the healthcare sector has and hasn't prepared, and what some of the best practices are. And the CyberPeace Institute has worked on those best practices to try to look at how we can use those to inform both decreasing the vulnerability of the healthcare sector, but then also using the knowledge from there to inform policy and normative debates. I would say for the other sector is clearly financial sector, because I think the financial sector has done a lot also around things like laws and norms, and around also its sense as a critical infrastructure. So I think there are issues that the humanitarian sector, I think particularly for big international organizations, where they are on the sort of critical, if they're considered as critical infrastructure, which is very different for an NGO, which has very different challenges. So I think that that's really important, because more and more it will be about how do you secure critical infrastructure, and therefore could the responsibilities and lessons learned from securing critical infrastructure help inform how to secure better, or to help organizations in the humanitarian sector. If I may, there's one aspect I'd like to come back to that was just being discussed before about trust. I think offline, if you look at the humanitarian sector, a lot of the trust has come from the proximity to the people that organizations are there to help. And that brings with it a certain vulnerability, because you are working amongst and living amongst the very people that are in need, and also the parties to armed conflict and the stakeholders that you need to inform and influence. And that vulnerability has been part of where trust has come from. In the digital world, is exactly the opposite. You don't necessarily have the same proximity, and vulnerability in a digital world is exactly what you cannot have. So there is going to have to be a rethink about how do you inform the notion of what it means to be trusted in a digital world, when digital proximity is not going to equate to the same as physical proximity. And you'll have more and more actors operating in that space. And now how do you define your trustworthiness? And that will come from how well you have managed your cybersecurity as part of that, but also how you are able to inform and engage with all stakeholders, which won't just be the traditional stakeholders. It will also be groups that are threat actors in the cyber world.
Is there any practice in the humanitarian world on constructing that type of trust in the cyber world that you're thinking about? I'm looking at Stuart and Balthasar here. Is there some emerging work, emergent practice?
Well, I think one thing we're seeing a recognition of, but not yet in practice, is the need for even greater transparency and better communication about how we do what we do, why we're doing it, and particularly why we need the data that we're asking for, how we'll be protecting it, etc. We have to be crystal clear to the populations that we serve, because we're not interacting with them in that interpersonal way, about what to expect, and also where to seek rectification and redress when things go wrong in their view. This is particularly difficult because we have a proliferation of different tools and channels, and despite our efforts to coordinate within clusters or even at the sort of intercluster level around how we communicate in the digital space, in any given response context, an affected person might have a dozen different channels, a dozen different interactive messaging experiences, and frankly, a dozen different digital footprints with different humanitarian organizations. They should not have the additional stress of tracking and understanding that. That's on us, but we haven't yet figured out how to do that well. There are some emerging promising practices, and I think it's great that we see integration of this issue, particularly on the data management side, in the discussions that are typically analog, right? How do we deliver cash assistance? How do we deliver health services? And what role does data play in that? How do we communicate to the populations that we're serving about that? It's not that complicated, and it's frankly not a technology issue. It's around managing expectations, being transparent about our work, and communicating effectively.
Balthasar, you mentioned this notion earlier, to translate experiences from the analog world into the digital space. Is there some experiences from the ICRC on the construction of trust? Is the DNA and the currency of the ICRC?
Absolutely. I think it's an emerging practice, and I would endorse what Stuart said in terms of how the emerging practice is shaping up. We had an important data breach, an important cyber attack earlier this year. And we immediately informed the world, and we have continued to inform the world in full transparency. I think that is a standard humanitarian actors need to apply to preserve the trust. And it's difficult and it's painful to do so. I think also to build on what Charlotte said, that I cannot conceive a humanitarian action that only is digital. So I believe it's a question of smartly combining boots on the ground, building of trust through exposure, through dialogue, through accepting vulnerability, and seeing the cyberspace then rather as an additional layer than a layer that would substitute for the direct human interaction that, in my view, remains absolutely relevant. We then try also to venture into the field of research and development. We are thinking about a possible digital emblem that would, in the cyberspace, offer the kind of protection that it offers in the analog world. It's fraught with all sorts of questions and dilemmas that I don't have the time to dwell on here. But I think we need indeed to look also then at the more bidirectional capacity that digital realm offers, because people can talk back to you, and people can talk back to me in far greater numbers than to our analog presence by staff. And that's also a huge opportunity. So how do we manage to measure what comes back, but also try to engage them people to build and keep that trust? But it's huge challenges, and I'm not sure we are equipped for them yet.
That brings me to, before we close, one topic I still wanted to address. It's this notion of organizational readiness. Isn't it just an ideal? Can you ever be ready for all these vulnerabilities? And what are the costs of being completely ready? So, Charlotte, can you reflect on the notion of institutional readiness? Given the enormity of the vulnerabilities and exposures, it seems to be quite a complicated ambition.
There is an obligation on humanitarian organizations because of the types of data they hold and their responsibility to carry out their mandates and missions to ensure that they can do that, which requires cybersecurity readiness. I think the CyberPeace Institute currently supports nearly 100 NGOs to build their cybersecurity readiness and capabilities. And that's a critical awareness raising. And I believe that the cyber attack against the ICRC earlier this year and its communication on that did make a lot of organizations, big and small, sit down and take a look at themselves and say, what would we have done? So for that, it was incredibly helpful and courageous of the ICRC to be able to communicate that, because it did push organizations to actually look at that. What we see from the organizations that we support and the research that we do is that organizations aren't ready. Partly it's because there is a seductiveness about technology and a push to use technology without necessarily understanding how to integrate that technology and to have a cybersecurity plan and readiness and preparedness within the organization, recognizing the specific threat landscape to the organization as well as the sort of risks and challenges. And that is because a lot of the funding of organizations is put to direct operational support to carry out their missions and mandates. And donors are less interested in funding what they considered as back office, but they're no longer back office because operations are carried out both physically but also digitally. So you have to recognize that the way donors are funding humanitarian response has to also adapt to that.
Also, perhaps from your operational experiences of organizational readiness, it seems, at least from an outside observer, also on the other side, on the cyber threat construction, there's a lot of innovation, constantly new things being developed. How do you deal with these things in the day-to-day life?
I think partially it's about recognizing that there's no silver bullet. We shouldn't be waiting for that. There's not going to be a shield or a solution or a single expert that deals with these issues for us. And organizations need to build the deliberative capacity, the capacity to identify, understand, and then design mitigation measures for risks in real time. This is not a one-off thing. This is how we do what we do now. And so that ability to understand and react across an organization, across functions, is essential to build. That requires investment, but that also requires new profiles. And it's not just digital natives, because a lot of the insight and instinct that we need in the cyber or digital realm is the humanitarian expertise that we already have. We can't keep keeping those separate. That's a false dichotomy, and knowing how to make judgment calls about the digital risks that we face or that affected populations are up against requires an understanding of what it means to do good humanitarian work. The technical coupled with the operational is really what we have to build. And I think collectively we can achieve that, but it requires collective action.
And it connects to what you said before, Balthasar, no? That you don't need just the tech expert, but and not only technology, but you need the human footprint in finding the solution for readiness.
Absolutely. And in order to build readiness, which is a constant trajectory, it's not an on and off switch. I think what we need to do is to combine worlds that normally don't talk to each other that easily. We have legal instruments, we have technological instruments, we have operational instruments, we have cultural instruments in terms of staff awareness and behavior, and we need to get these worlds to talk together to build a more robust resilience. We need standard operating procedures. We have them for situations of hostage taking. We do not have them yet for all types of cyber attacks. That's also a constant capacity to adjust to the world. We organized together with the Luxembourg Cybersecurity Agency and other partners last week a cyber range, which is a simulation exercise with actors from NGOs, from international organizations, diplomats, technologists, to really practice scenarios that you are under attack. So I believe that there is a lot that we can do, but it requires worlds to work together that normally perhaps haven't built the muscle to do so. And lastly, I think we need also to build the muscle to speak with actors. Humanitarians have perhaps not had much experience to talk to. And that's a whole issue of how do we engage with hacker groups? We have learned to engage with non-state armed groups of all sorts. Some of them are considered by states as terrorist groups. We have had to build muscle to do so. And I believe at least some of the humanitarian community, some organizations will probably have to learn how to move with the weapon bearers, if I can call them, people who can exercise negative or positive action on humanitarians in the cyberspace, and see how can we engage them.
We're coming to the end of this podcast, and I just want to ask you if there's any final reflection you would like to leave with our listeners on our question, how to protect humanitarian organizations in the digital space. Stuart, why don't you kickstart? Just very briefly.
I think the most important thing is talking more about when things go wrong. Report incidents, as we've seen with the example of the ICRC, analyze what happened, and then put measures in place to mitigate it in the future. That has to happen at the institutional level, and it's even more critical at the sector level. We can only do this together.
I agree. It's indeed learning to adjust at it. I also believe that Geneva has a very interesting platform to learn from each other, to build solutions that are specific also to humanitarian organizations. I believe the humanitarian sector has challenges that exist in other sectors, but it has its specific challenges. And I believe Geneva is in this sense an extremely interesting platform to also learn and get stronger as a collective.
And Charlotte, you have the last word.
I would say that humanitarian organizations should have a posture which assumes that a cyber attack will happen, and they will be better able to manage that, and the trust in them will be towards them will be better if it is shown that they have taken positive steps beforehand to prepare for this, and that they know how to respond. And that trust is going to be critical towards all of their stakeholders, and that they can also get help from organizations like the CyberPeace Institute and others to help them build their cyber posture. And I think that will be critical as they go forward.
Charlotte, Stuart, Balthasar, thank you very much for being with the Graduate Institute tonight. And thank you to our listeners for tuning in.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That was Stuart Campo, Charlotte Lindsey, Balthasar Staehelin and Achim Wennmann discussing how to protect humanitarian sectors against cyber attacks and what are the challenges encountered to mitigate these risks in the digital space. This episode was produced in partnership with the Diplomatic Club of Geneva and the CyberPeace Institute. For more information about the Institute, please visit graduateinstitute.ch. I'm Lena Menge, thanks for listening.